We wanted to take a look at this video about whether or not Odysseus discovered America, and this was 6 days ago by Lantern Jack, a historian and published author with a PhD in ancient philosophy from Princeton, host of the Ancient Greece Declassified. I am very curious to see, seeing as I am kind of a history nerd, and a religion and mythology nerd too. So you know what? I guess we can strap right in, boys and girls. I don't know if there are any girls watching right now, but it's kind of... But you know. So, could the Odyssey preserve echoes of long-lost voyages beyond the Mediterranean? Perhaps even across the Atlantic? A speculative discussion informed by Homeric scholarship, archaeology, and ancient literature. So, let's go ahead and check out and see whether or not Odysseus, otherwise known to the Romans as Ulysses, discover America.
Where did Odysseus go? People have been wondering that for 3,000 years. If you picked up a copy of Homer's Odyssey, you may have seen maps that try to reconstruct his 10-year-long voyage.
I do remember that I don't remember all of the locations that Odysseus went. I do know that we studied the Odyssey in 8th grade, and we had to do little projects on the Odyssey and how it all went down. But I do distinctly remember there being a place called the Land of the Lotus Eaters, where if you eat the lotuses, then you would not be able to stop. And I know that it was somewhere in North Africa. And I do remember him being stranded on one island that was ruled by one of the wind gods, Aeolus, and it was trying to blow him away.
They often look like this.
Yes, like this. Yes, this place, the Lotus Eaters. I knew that it was off the coast of Africa. And this is what everyone believes happened.
Or this.
Or this. But no, the Land of the Lotus Eaters is the only one that I remember.
Or this. The details change, but they usually assume the same thing. Odysseus spent 10 years wandering inside the Mediterranean.
Yep.
This map disagrees.
The Voyage of Odysseus, according to H. Mertz, 1964. I mean, we'd have to think about this from a what? Not maybe chronological, but it depends on how long he was out at sea for. If the I don't remember everything. I don't even remember reading any part of the Odyssey. We just remember reading certain parts of it that were relevant to the class. But how long was Odysseus out at sea between wherever these locations may have been?
It shows Odysseus and crew sailing the ocean blue in the year 1172 BC, which is ridiculous, right? Well, maybe. Or maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Instead of where did Odysseus go, perhaps we should be asking what kind of information is the Odyssey preserving? What if the travel portion of the epic isn't really about a return home from Troy? What if that was merely the framework into which a much older story was inserted?
I mean, you could say the same thing about a lot of ancient stories.
A story that preserves the memory of a voyage far beyond the world known to the Greeks who eventually wrote this epic down.
I mean, but expanding upon that, there's the concept known as within within religion and mythologies, and really just stories preserved by ancient cultures in general, known as the culture hero, where the deeds of such people are remembered for generations and could have been based on figures that existed in such a distant past that no written records of them existed. I mean, Heracles is one of those culture heroes, and I guess Odysseus could be considered as such. I guess Gilgamesh would be considered one too, and to a certain extent, like the biblical patriarchs could be considered culture heroes as well. Remember sleeping during your English class in freshman year? You were learning about the Odyssey. You gave up on your classes at the last quarter? Oh lord. I remember I was a straight A student in the 6th grade. But then I started getting when it came to English class. And so that streak kind of ruined itself. Let's just say 7th grade was my worst year. I'll leave it at that.
A story older perhaps than the Trojan War itself.
Ancient Greece Declassified. Let's go. Ancient Greece Declassified School Survival Guide.
The Odyssey is a grand adventure story whose ultimate aim is homecoming.
Yep.
Odysseus is the original homecoming king, though he doesn't do a very good job of it because he spends 10 years tossed around.
Yeah, everything in the ancient Greek world keeps trying to stop him because, of course, we wanted to give this man a break. But then Dante in his Inferno decided that Odysseus didn't receive enough torture simply because amongst the Roman origin story, they believed themselves to have originally come from Troy. And when they suffered defeat at the hands of the Trojans, I guess Dante decided that the Greeks didn't deserve to get off scot-free from the Trojan War. Your dad passed away several months before. Oh, that's what happened? I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, that'll happen to people whenever you lose a loved one. It really does take a toll on you.
The high seas before he finally gets home. His wanderings take him through exotic lands and bring him face to face with monsters, ghosts, and sultry goddesses. Despite these fantastical elements, the ancient Greeks believed that the Odyssey and the Iliad preserved real memories of a long-lost glorious age. Modern archaeology has partially borne this out. We now know that Greece was home to a surprisingly advanced Bronze Age civilization half a millennium before the Homeric poems were written down.
Yeah, they were the Minoans. We know about them from their ancient architecture that exists on Crete. We also know that they had a writing system that we have yet to decipher, so we don't really know what language that they would have spoken.
Those later Greeks could have imagined. But that earlier Mycenaean culture, as it's called, collapsed during the 1100s BC.
Yeah, during the Bronze Age collapse. A lot of civilizations collapsed during that time. New Kingdom Egypt, the Mitanni Empire that everyone forgets the existence of, who strangely worshipped Hindu gods, specifically Vedic ones, the Hittites, and then I think, was it a version of Babylon? Or was it a version of Assyria that was in control of Mesopotamia at the time? I think it was Babylon, if I recall correctly.
Dark Ages, and the art of writing was forgotten for 400 years.
Yeah.
After literacy re-emerged in the 700s BC, Greeks started recording the oral epic poetry that had served as the main information-preserving technology during those preceding centuries.
Yeah, and they were able to remember a surprising amount of details about what may or may not have happened during the Trojan War.
Most important oral epics were the Iliad and Odyssey.
And those aren't the only things that were, quote-unquote, lost. You get a collapse, you get a collapse, you get a collapse, yes. Yeah, the story of, the Trojan War actually took place at around the same time as various other events in some other cultures. The time of the Trojan War suspiciously happened at around the same time that the Kurukshetra War mentioned in the Hindu Mahabharata took place, which is a battle that Krishna was supposed to have partook in. And it was also around the same time that David and Solomon's kingdom was supposed to have existed. But the proper records of all three of these were never really written down until centuries later.
Now, whether or not a blind bard named Homer existed and gave them their final form...
Was he blind?
...is debated. But either way...
Nearly fumbled the QuickTime event.
Their content derives from an older oral tradition. In this discussion, I will follow the scholarly convention of referring to Homer, even if he never existed, as a shorthand for whoever or whatever process crystallized these two epics at the end of the Dark Ages.
Yeah, the general consensus is that they were just collaborative efforts. Maybe Homer was the one that compiled them all together, or maybe Homer was just a composite of all of these collaborative efforts, but the same thing also technically applies to other epic poems and scriptures and stuff. A lot of them tend to be just collaborative efforts in order to preserve culture, religious traditions, history, and the likes.
Amazingly, these epic poems remember some remarkably accurate details of the Bronze.
You're 103% going to imagine chat messages as just QuickTime events now. Well, if I had more chatters, that were like zooming at a mile a minute, I wouldn't have to be so, I guess, distracted. But I enjoy reading your messages anyway.
Bronze Age. Types of armor that had stopped being produced.
Oh yeah, one of the things that people were, the armor that existed. Yet for some reason, Christopher Nolan's Odyssey needs to use Roman-style armor.
Hundreds of years before Homer, the interior layout of palaces that had been destroyed.
Yeah, here's a Minoan palace, I'm pretty sure.
Destroyed centuries earlier. At a broader level, some scholars interpret the Iliad as reflecting the kind of large-scale coalition warfare that accompanied the Bronze Age collapse, and some scholars interpret the Odyssey as containing echoes of the chaotic migrations that happened.
Yes, the so-called sea peoples that the ancient Egyptians mentioned.
As several Bronze Age societies simultaneously crumbled. In any case, after the Greeks emerged from the Dark Ages with a new alphabet and renewed maritime trade routes, they started wondering whether the exotic places described in the Odyssey might be based on real locations.
I mean, we know that Troy existed, we have its ruins, and there's ample evidence to show that the Trojan War happened too.
Not everybody, of course. There were even then skeptics who thought the whole thing was entirely made up.
Yeah, pretty much.
But the poem describes the fantastical lands Odysseus visited with the same richness and specificity it brings to the places that were unquestionably real.
Yep.
And so some people started identifying episodes in the Odyssey with real locations they encountered while sailing across the Mediterranean. By the Roman period, many of these identifications had become standardized, and they still form the basis of many modern maps that attempt to reconstruct Odysseus' wanderings through the mythical Mediterranean. But there are problems with these maps and reconstructions.
Yes, I'm guessing it's because it's maybe some of these places may have been like mythical. I'm guessing some scholars had trouble identifying certain places just either because they seem outlandish or maybe something else.
During his travels, Odysseus encounters powerful forces of nature and strange geographic features. A giant whirlpool, an island perennially shrouded in fog, and a land where the days are so long there's barely any night to speak of.
Now that sounds like the Arctic during the summertime.
Homer's descriptions of them are rich in specific detail. The problem is, no such places exist in the Mediterranean.
Right. I see where he's going with this.
They do exist out in the ocean. But that's crazy, right?
Do whirlpools form in the Mediterranean, though?
There's no way Odysseus would have made it out that far.
It's possible.
Especially on a return voyage from Troy to nearby Greece.
Yeah, imagine, Troy is literally right next to Greece. How exactly do you get lost in that?
And yet, Homer explicitly places some of Odysseus' adventures beyond the Mediterranean.
Does
Odysseus' ship sails on Okeanos, the Greek word from which we get ocean. That word is never used in reference to inland seas like the Mediterranean. But hold on.
That would mean that the Greeks had knowledge of the Atlantic Ocean in general. I mean, they don't call the Straits of Gibraltar the Pillars of Heracles for nothing.
If that's what the story plainly says, then why did the Greeks map his travels within the Mediterranean Sea?
Probably because at the time, it's all they really knew.
Well, it seems that even the authority of Homer had its limits.
Yeah.
When they heard Okeanos in the Odyssey, I'm just going to say ocean from now on,
Yeah.
most Greeks thought it had to be poetic exaggeration. They didn't take it literally, because in those days they probably had a hard time imagining any Greek venturing out into the Atlantic Ocean. The Phoenicians were already doing it.
Yeah, they made it as far north as... Obviously, they made it as far north as Britain, like right up there.
And the Greeks would later as well, from the 500s BC on.
The Greeks copied the Phoenicians' idea and made colonies, and then the Phoenicians had a colony so big it made colonies.
But even then, after exploring areas of both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, most Greeks of this rebooted civilization, let's call it Ancient Greece 2.0.
2.0, let's go. I don't know what you would actually, don't we usually refer to it as classical Greece?
Found it hard to believe that sailors from Ancient Greece 1.0, our Mycenaeans, were able to reach as far or perhaps even farther than they could.
Look, you mentioned the Indian Ocean. I mean, they knew about India. I mean, where else would they get their spices from?
So despite explicit mentions of the ocean in the Odyssey, they kept looking for places within the Mediterranean that could have plausibly inspired the mythical locations described by Homer. The whirlpool of Charybdis was identified with the Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily.
Do whirlpools even appear there?
Even though the currents there, while strong, never come close to an all-consuming vortex.
I see.
The island of the winds became Lipari near
Oh yeah, that island that I was mentioning.
Italy, even though Odysseus sails due east from Homer's island for 9 days and nights, while from Lipari, you'd hit the Italian coast in a matter of hours. The land of the Phaeacians, which in Homer is placed at the extremity of the known world, became Kerkyra, aka Corfu, one of the closest Greek islands to Odysseus' home on Ithaca. But here's where things get more complicated. Homer doesn't just say that Odysseus and crew sail on the ocean. He says at one point that they cross the ocean and
They crossed it.
reach a land at the western extremity of the world. The world, by the way, is probably imagined here as a flat disk, though that's never explicitly stated.
I mean, even the ancient Greeks knew that it was round. They were able to prove it using these giant poles that were set up in Egypt, I think. Or maybe I'm thinking of something else, but I vaguely remember hearing about that.
Here's a modern reconstruction of what that worldview might have.
Yes, this is what at the very west they would probably assume that this is what they're talking about. Either that or whatever.
Looked like. You can see parts of Europe, Northern Africa, and Western Asia forming a kind of world island with the Mediterranean inside it and the vast ocean circling around it.
I do know it was after when classical Greece started that they considered China to have been a mythical place, but even the Romans knew of China's existence.
But that's not the whole picture, because both Homer and his contemporary Hesiod imagine lands across the ocean to the west.
Yeah.
Now, to get back to...
I mean, that's what we thought that for to hundreds of years, or well over 1,000 years after that point. I mean, that was what Christopher Columbus's voyage was about. It's like, if we can get to India from here, then we don't need to go all the way around Africa.
To the Odyssey. Shortly before Odysseus and his crew are set to cross the ocean, they come to a land where the days are so long, Homer says, that a man could earn 2 wages if he did not need sleep. Now, the days don't get that long in the Mediterranean, but they do in the far north of Europe.
Yeah.
And there are other details in that passage on the land of the Laestrygonians that also point away from the Mediterranean and to the north.
Now, the question is, did they ever point out, ice or how cold it was if it was in a land where the sun never set?
More on that later. In any case, a few pages later, Odysseus crosses the ocean and reaches a land at the western extremity of the world, the land of the dead. And this place has its own strange geography. It's described as a land perpetually shrouded in fog, with tracts of low vegetation and several rivers, some of which have unusual or otherworldly qualities. Now, obviously, this could just be a made-up or mythical place.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that earlier.
But what if we tried looking for a real place that matches that description? Do you know what the foggiest place on Earth is? A place which also happens to be on the Atlantic, with many rivers of strangely colored water and windswept grasslands? Newfoundland.
Newfoundland. That's where... Aren't there a number of Viking settlements on Newfoundland? How far south did the Vikings actually go? I do know they managed to get through the St. Lawrence and the peninsula to the south, where Maine and Labrador are.
Canada's easternmost island. Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula in particular is one of the foggiest places on Earth, thanks to the collision of the warm Gulf Stream coming from the south
Okay, I get it.
and the cold Labrador current flowing
Oh wait, Labrador's further north than the St. Lawrence. I retract what I said earlier.
in from the north. It's also the first place in North America you'd reach if crossing the Atlantic from northern Europe. And this isn't just theoretical. 1,000 years ago, Norse explorers made that exact
This.
crossing
It's Leif Erikson's path. Hinger-dinger-dergen.
and reached this region, almost 5 centuries before Columbus.
Now the question is, did Odysseus reach Greenland as well?
Now, does this prove that Odysseus went to Newfoundland?
Not
No.
really.
But now,
But it is some food for thought.
we're confronted with another puzzle. Whether this foggy land across the ocean is entirely made up or not, why does Odysseus go there? If this is a story of a man trying to reach Greece from nearby Troy, why does Homer have him sailing to the literal edge of the world? That makes no sense.
Because the gods decreed it.
Until you realize 2 things about the epic tradition that produced this story. First, it was a common trope of ancient adventure epics that the hero journeys to the edge of the world.
The hero's journey, one of the oldest storytelling tropes in the book.
However, that liminal realm was imagined by the culture telling the story.
Yep.
For example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the titular hero reaches the literal edge of the earth, descends into the subterranean passage through which the sun travels each night, races through its darkness, and emerges at the opposite rim of the world. The Odyssey belongs to that broader tradition of adventure epics. So it makes sense that Homer, or earlier bards who told stories of Odysseus included an Edge of the World episode, because that's where stories like this wanted to go.
Given the Greece's close proximity to the Middle East, a lot of Greece's traditions are heavily inspired by that of Mesopotamian tradition, to the point to where they even speculate that Pythagoras may have studied in Babylon.
That's what audiences expected from them, even if the geography made no sense to the story. The hero leaves the known world and enters a realm of myth and monsters.
Yes, yeah.
It is for this reason that most classicists today think it pointless to try and trace the voyage of Odysseus on a real map, because the geography of these episodes follows the logic of epic storytelling rather than the logic of any actual voyage. Therefore, attempting to
They just wanted to tell a good story. I mean, who else doesn't want to hear a really good story about going to a very foggy island with strange colored rivers?
locate real-world places that perfectly correspond to the localities in the myth is, according to them, a fool's errand.
But it is fun to do, and they can't stop me from having fun, so...
But there's a second reason that might explain why Odysseus' travels take him so far from home. One that is grounded in Homeric scholarship, but with one further leap. As hinted at earlier, scholars generally agree that the Odysseus saga evolved over hundreds of years of oral storytelling, alongside many other epics, which sometimes influenced and borrowed from each other. The Odyssey is a patchwork of many layers, some of which appear to be way older than others. Many scholars think Odysseus' story started off as a homecoming tale about a hero returning from war to find his household in disorder, his wife beset by suitors, and his son in danger. The core narrative likely centered on Odysseus returning to Ithaca in disguise, his recognition by a few loyal figures,
Oh, I think I remember this.
and his revenge and restoration as king. Homerists such as Martin West have argued that Odysseus' travel narrative, which makes up less than a fifth of the whole epic, was a later addition that incorporates or emulates earlier, now lost tales of wandering and mythic voyage traditions.
Now that actually does make sense in the context of, like, other books as well. Especially if it's like a sacred work, there's usually some a base series of books. I know that's how the Vedas work. The oldest books of the Rig Veda, I think, are 2 through 6, and then 8 and 9 got added later, and then 1 and 10 were the last to be considered as part of the Vedas.
But why would Homer or other bards rip off those older stories? Well, because that's how the epic tradition works.
Yeah, they were never meant to be set in stone.
Heroes often inherit, repeat, and try to surpass the adventures of earlier heroes. For example, Aeneas' travels in Virgil's Aeneid deliberately echo Odysseus' journey, because Virgil wanted his hero to rival the older, established adventure hero. What if Homer was doing the same thing? What if, like Virgil,
just basing them off of even older traditions?
Later, he deliberately sent his hero on a grand tour of the mythological landscapes that earlier, now forgotten heroes had explored. But this changes the question that brought us here. It's no longer did Odysseus venture out into the ocean, it's given that there seems to have been a pre-Homeric tradition about a voyage or voyages in the ocean, what, if anything, might those stories preserve?
Yeah.
And now we get to the question that recent scholarship has not asked.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the thing that the mainstream archaeology doesn't want to entertain.
Could those older stories
because if you dare try to question the mainstream narrative, they will blacklist you to the ends of the earth. Just like that one guy who found evidence that was contrary to... found some evidence that would found something that would rewrite the history of human settlement of the Americas. Like, the mainstream idea at the time was that it was the Clovis culture that was believed to be the first people to inhabit the Americas. But this one guy discovered evidence that there was a culture that predated the Clovis, and when he tried to present those findings, he ended up getting blacklisted, and he lost all of his credibility. But it wasn't until years later that his findings were all but confirmed, and so... but the damage had already been done.
Reflect, however distantly and transformed through myth, memories of real journeys beyond the Mediterranean world, perhaps even beyond the ocean? That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
But how would we even begin to investigate it? Well, we could start by asking, are there any other ancient texts that speak of a land across the ocean? Because if the Odyssey is an isolated case, it's easy to discount it.
I mean, the You're going to sleep now. All right, take care. But, I mean, that's what people would say about, like, Atlantis.
But if other ancient writers also describe not only lands beyond the ocean, but journeys to those remote locations, then that might warrant a closer look.
I think a bigger question is, did other cultures make mention of lands beyond the ocean?
And here's where the rabbit hole deepens.
Let's go.
Because we don't just find one or two other ancient accounts of lands west of the ocean, we find over a dozen. Now, to be clear, this does not mean that we have 12 independent historical reports of America from ancient libraries.
I'm guessing they all kind of piggyback off each other.
Some of these accounts are clearly mythical, some have allegorical elements, some may derive from common sources, and several are frustratingly vague. Still, the pattern is striking.
The ancients never made it easy for us. Whenever the ancients recorded history, they usually recorded it in a very grandiose storytelling manner, because to them it was a lot more palpable.
Plato's Timaeus is famous for giving us the Atlantis story. But when he describes where Atlantis was located, he says something that is perhaps more interesting for our purposes than the Atlantis story
I know that the alternative archaeology community says that Atlantis was in West Africa.
itself. He says that
If you know what the Riccott structure is.
Atlantis was in the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call Gibraltar, and that beyond Atlantis there were more islands, and beyond those islands a great continent. He then adds that in former times, people were able to cross the ocean to reach that enormous landmass. Unfortunately, Plato doesn't tell us anything more about those supposed ancient crossings. But that brings us to the next example. A text in the Aristotelian corpus called On Marvelous Things Heard, as well as a passage from the historian Diodorus
If even. Well, then how exactly did Odysseus make it back?
Siculus, preserve two versions of what appears to be the same story.
Well, we got these information from somewhere.
A group of Carthaginian sailors discover a fertile island far to the west of Gibraltar. According to both accounts,
I mean, we know that the Canary Islands aren't that far off the coast of Spain and Africa.
the land is so rich and desirable, the Carthaginian state restricts further voyages there, fearing that large numbers of citizens would emigrate and the homeland would be depopulated. This western island paradise may or may not be connected to the Greek tradition of the Blessed Isles. The authors from Hesiod onward place these islands at the western edge of Okeanos. In the earliest accounts, they're not ordinary places at all, but a kind of paradise where heroes and demigods enjoy a blissful afterlife.
So, Elysium or not quite Elysium?
Hence the name, the Islands of the Blessed. But Hesiod includes an oddly specific detail. He writes that there, quote, the grain-giving earth bears honey-sweet fruit flourishing thrice a year.
Yeah. Ancient people were able to calculate very accurately the size of the earth and knew it was round. They knew there was another continent, they just couldn't get there. Yeah. I think I mentioned that earlier in the reaction.
Now that could simply be poetic exaggeration,
Yeah, they knew it was there, but they just didn't know how.
but it's at least interesting to note that unlike the Mediterranean or the Atlantic islands near Gibraltar, such as Madeira or the Canaries, there are parts of the Caribbean and Central America and tropical South America where fruit do grow year-round. Coincidence? Could be.
Probably. Has science gone too far?
And yet the plot thickens.
Let's see.
By the Hellenistic and Roman periods, after major advances in astronomy and a renewed interest in navigation, some geographers began trying to identify the Blessed Isles with real places. Several associated them with the Canary Islands, others placed them further out west. In a recent article and then book, the Italian physicist and historian of science, Lucio Russo, argued that the lines of latitude and longitude that the astronomer Hipparchus gave for the Blessed Isles match up almost perfectly with the Caribbean islands known as the Lesser Antilles,
Ooh.
which
The
include
plot really is thickening.
the Virgin Islands, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and others.
Climate was also way warmer back then. Bunda's saying something about the hair makes you compare it to Randy Random from RimWorld. I don't know anything about RimWorld, but yeah.
Whether Russo is right remains debated, but if he is, that would suggest that the Greeks and or Carthaginians may have discovered how to navigate using the North Atlantic gyre.
I mean, if you take a look at Africa, well, my avatar's in the way. If you take a look at where Africa and South America are, they're a lot closer than you might think, but the peoples of those places were not that particularly concerned with venturing out too far into the sea, but, you know.
A large clockwise system of currents and winds. You see, if you're trying to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a pre-modern sailboat, there aren't that many routes that would work.
Yeah.
In fact, there are basically just two. The North Atlantic is dominated by two major systems of winds and currents, two great ocean highways, as it were. The first is the large clockwise circulation of the North.
Yeah, we learned about gyres in the context of ocean pollution, but you know.
North Atlantic gyre, shaped by the trade winds, the westerlies, and currents like the Gulf Stream.
Yeah, it's a good game.
This is the route that
You're not motivated to play it since there's no DLCs, I see.
Columbus and later European voyagers used, which first takes you south from Europe and then west toward the Caribbean.
Yeah, and then Odysseus's journey implied that he went north towards the Arctic and then westward.
And that route would actually be consistent with the story of how the Carthaginians discovered their western island paradise.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a northern subpolar gyre, which moves
Okay, I understand now.
counterclockwise through the high.
Oh, and this is most likely how the Vikings were able to reach the Americas as well. Only around the 7th to 8th centuries did it get colder. Before then, there were vineyards in England. I guess that wouldn't surprise me.
latitudes, and helped shape the routes later taken by the Vikings to
Yes, I figured this would be the case.
reach Newfoundland. And this brings us to the ancient account that is perhaps most relevant to our investigation.
Let's check it.
In a dialogue by Plutarch called On the Face Which Appears in the Orb of the Moon, one of the characters,
Otherwise known as the rabbit on the moon to East Asian cultures, because the rabbit on the moon is pounding rice cakes.
tells a story that Carthage used to send an embassy every 30 years across the ocean to the land of Kronos. The speaker in the dialogue claims to have
Which Kronos?
received a detailed account of one such embassy from a Carthaginian who had taken part in it. The weird thing is, rather than heading west, this recurring expedition proceeds through the northern seas and requires several stops along the
Oh, do you know how many this background music? You know how many times I've heard this background music before?
way. The voyage is described in enough detail that a modern team of Greek astronomers attempted to reconstruct it.
Oh.
What was their conclusion? That the route described in Plutarch plausibly maps onto a North Atlantic itinerary reaching North America. The team argued that the journey was feasible within the time frame given by the text, and that its geographical and astronomical details align well with the route through Britain, Iceland, Greenland, and eventually Newfoundland.
I see.
Their interpretation remains controversial.
Of course it's controversial. A lot of people don't want to believe that it was possible for them to make these journeys, simply because it just defies all of our expectations about what the ancients were capable of.
But there's an interesting detail in Plutarch's story. Part of the journey passes through a region where the sun only dips slightly below the horizon for 1 hour each night.
Which is the Arctic.
Sound familiar?
And that is very similar to that one story from the Odyssey.
We're suddenly back in the same northern world of extreme daylight that seemed to appear in the Odyssey. And here's where it gets really weird. In Plutarch's story, when the Carthaginians arrive in that distant land across the ocean, they find a population of Greek speakers there.
Really? There's...
Not recently arrived Greeks, not sailors blown off course, Greeks whose presence was already ancient, stemming from a time long before the Trojan War.
If this is true, then that would be very impressive. But if this was true, then what exactly happened to them after that?
Which makes you at least wonder if Plutarch's story implies the existence of Greek expeditions across the ocean, perhaps 1,000 years before the Carthaginian embassy he describes. Could the Odyssey preserve a faint memory of one or more of those primordial voyages?
And the question is, would they have encountered Native Americans? And if so, would they have either killed each other or would they have assimilated with them?
Now, before we go any further, we need to acknowledge what we're actually dealing with here.
Yeah, let's at least set the record straight.
Every text we've looked at comes with serious problems. Plato's account of the great continent is part of the Atlantis story. The Carthaginian island described by Diodorus and pseudo-Aristotle may have been Madeira, the Canaries, or some other Atlantic island closer to Europe. The Blessed Isles could simply be a mythical paradise, and Plutarch's account may be nothing more than a philosophical tale dressed up as a travel narrative.
It could just be all of the above, if we're being honest. The truth is usually somewhere in the middle.
So take everything we've discussed with a large grain of salt. None of these texts proves that Greeks, Carthaginians, or anyone else crossed the Atlantic in
There would already be proof of Greek civilization because they love to build with stone.
antiquity. But even after applying
Of course Bunda is the doubter. Are you kidding? We got doubters in the chat.
all of those caveats, we're still left with a curious fact. The Odyssey is not the only ancient text that places strange lands beyond the ocean. We now seem to be dealing with a cluster of traditions that do exactly that. Which means it's worth returning to Homer and asking, are there any other details in the Odyssey that make more sense in an Atlantic context than in a Mediterranean one? I think there are actually several. Too many to cover in a single episode. And it's not just me, by the way. In preparation for this episode, I found an astonishing number of books and articles, more than 20, dating back to 1898, I think was the first, arguing for and reconstructing an oceanic itinerary of Odysseus.
I wonder. So, not even necessarily going as far as the Americas, but just traveling along the coast.
Now again, classicists today almost universally reject or ignore all such attempts. And to be honest, I haven't read them all myself. In fact, I haven't read a single one cover to cover. But I've tracked down brief summaries of many of them, maybe most of them, and as someone familiar with the Homeric scholarship, I think almost all of these theories suffer from at least one of two fatal flaws that doom them from the outset and make them easy to dismiss by anyone who has studied the layered compositional history of the Homeric poems.
Yeah, at least I'm not going to make believe that I know anything about this stuff, but
The first fatal flaw is that they try to make Troy the starting point and Ithaca the end point. But that's a mistake because, as we've discussed, if there was a journey or journeys that inspired the tales of Odysseus' wanderings, they had nothing to do with Odysseus or the Trojan War.
Yeah, if we're talking, if they're all, if all of these stories are just based on each other, piggybacking off of what presumably could have been a singular tradition so far back in the past that it's since been embellished, there's only so much that you can do.
The wanderings of Odysseus are not of Odysseus. Treating them as such forces the supposed voyage into the time frame of the Trojan War, roughly the period of the Bronze Age collapse. And the archaeology from that era hardly suggests that people were embarking on ambitious transoceanic expeditions while much of the Eastern Mediterranean world was collapsing. The second fatal flaw is that they try to map out one long, continuous itinerary from start to finish. In other words, they try to put all 12 or so places Odysseus visits on a map and connect them with a single chronological route. But that's also a mistake, because the ordering of episodes in the Odyssey is unlikely to be exactly the same as it was in the older material. The Homeric tradition did not work by simply copy-pasting entire narratives wholesale from earlier sources. Bards like Homer were experts at stitching together a new patchwork from a trove of pre-existing material, in the same way that a chef creates a new dish from a set of standard ingredients.
I guess that makes sense.
That said, it's plausible, perhaps even likely, that one or two shorter sequences of episodes within this patchwork preserve the order in which they appeared in the original material. In other words, a sequence of, say, 3 or even 5 or perhaps 7 episodes in Odysseus' journey may preserve the same order of mythical locations as an earlier source, but it's extremely unlikely that the entire sequence of over 12 stops was preserved intact.
Yeah, Greek and Phoenician ships were also built specifically for the conditions of the Mediterranean.
Okay, now that we are aware of these two traps, let us, like Odysseus sailing between Scylla and Charybdis, try to avoid both of them, hopefully with better luck than he had, and see if we can find any more evidence in the epic of travel beyond the Mediterranean.
Okay, I had already agreed with chat that we would pause the video halfway through and save the rest of it for later. We can definitely continue this video on Saturday, but yeah, definitely a lot of food for thought. Definitely a lot of food for thought in terms of this, whether or not any of it can be considered, I guess, true or false. Well, I guess that's up to interpretation.